He canceled the Mafia meeting at the last minute. The empty folding chairs in the back room felt like a threat. David had been on his way to the warehouse to deliver a crate when his phone buzzed with one curt line: "Meeting canceled." He turned left into the lot instead of right into the alley and saw an old man hunched against the pillar, shoulders shaking, hands twisting a small brass key like it might bite him. The man was not the kind of person you expected to find where dangerous people sometimes made arrangements. He smelled faintly of sweat and aquarium water, wore a cardigan with the patch on the elbow, and had eyes that had known every winter. Birds were arguing in the tall light pole above them, and the lot smelled of oil and fried food. A car alarm, distant and tinny, punctured the silence. Someone powerful had called off a meeting because something had gone wrong. That simple change rippled outward. David crouched, careful, the city lights yellow and mean over his shoulder. He offered his hand to the old man, a small human gesture. The old man handed him the key instead. Underneath the key was a scrap of paper soaked with rain that had already dried in the seam of his palm. On it was a single stamped word and an address that matched the storage unit 2 blocks from the pier. David pocketed both and said nothing. He could not know yet that the scrap would tilt the chessboard of the neighborhood and make everyone take a side. There was a hush to the lot, the kind held in a mouth before someone admits a secret. The protector moved closer, a man who had been watching the perimeter of the lot from the diner window for years. Marcus had the posture of someone who had been stood up by death but kept appointments with loyalty. He walked over as if he had always belonged to problems like this. He squatted a respectful distance away and asked one question: "Who is he to you?" The old man looked at Marcus like he was a man who could hold a gun or a rosary with equal conviction. His voice came out as if dressed from a well. "My son. The small brass key is my son." That was the moment the ordinary became complicated. A key and a name, a canceled meeting and a crying man in a parking lot. What followed would pull neighbors out of their routines, call in favors kept for funerals, and force David to decide how much of himself he would risk to answer a secret that should have stayed buried. David listened when the old man spoke, and the details arrived like coins slid one by one into a fountain. The son had been a mechanic who worked at the pier for years, a man named Elias who had gotten into trouble because he loved the wrong people and fixed the wrong cars. He had disappeared 2 weeks earlier after a late shift, leaving a toaster on a counter, a note with a joke that David could not yet find funny, and a dented enamel mug that smelled permanently of cigarette smoke. Now the scrap in the old man's hand had an address and a stamp that David could not place, a symbol like a coiled snake eating its tail. Marcus frowned at the symbol. It was not simple graffiti. It was the kind of insignia that meant a debt had been marked public and private at once. The parking lot smelled suddenly of distant fryer oil and rain, of old wool, of someone else's cologne. Marcus said, "You should not be here, old man." The old man leaned his forehead against his knuckles and then told them what everyone would learn in the next days. Elias had been seen with a man named Ortiz. Ortiz was the kind of man who kept a ledger. He kept lists and men. He kept promises he never intended to keep. The scrap with the stamped word had been dropped when Elias fled, or when someone else fled him. Either way, it was a map. David was a delivery driver at a downtown bakery. He knew how to read streets and how to keep his head down. He knew how to smile at children and nod at gossiping neighbors. He did not know how to confront men who kept ledgers for a living. Marcus, a protector in the informal sense, had a past that kept the neighborhood safe when the police took too long. Marcus had friends in low places and in places with official badges. He had a code and a restless elbow. When the old man named Elias, Marcus felt the old code tighten like a strap. He promised to help. The promise was small and big at once. It had teeth. They walked together to the storage unit, the key heavy in David's pocket. Marcus called Lena on the way, a woman who fixed phones and kept secrets in a drawer next to the cash register of her repair shop. Marcus did not ask permission. He called because he knew Lena could pull a camera feed if she put enough loose change into a man at the diner. Lena told Marcus to meet her at the pier in 20 minutes and to keep his phone off. Marcus did exactly that. David kept his phone but put it face down on the passenger seat and stared at the streetlights as if they might deliver instructions by blinking. The storage unit at the address was a gray metal maw at the end of a row. The lock on the door was bent, like someone had tried to force it and change their mind. Inside, the smell was oil and old rubber, the same as Elias's coffee mug, oddly comforting and wrong. A motorcycle helmet sat on a milk crate, scuffed through with a crude sticker. In the corner, an old duffel breathed the smell of laundry and iron. A small tin box contained a photograph, folded, of Elias with a woman who smiled like summer and a child whose knees were always scraped. A note in Elias's handwriting read, "I owe them a favor because I saved the man once." The small brass key from the old man fit a lockbox inside the crate. In it, a single item, a pager with a beep schedule and a number. On a separate scrap, the symbol repeated, and under it, a line scrawled, "Find Miguel before they do." That line became a direction. The first scene of collision in this story was not a gunshot, but a pager. The pager meant messages, meant schedules, meant men whose jobs were counting. It was also oddly analog in a digital age, the kind of relic you only used if you wanted to keep things off the grid. Marcus, David, the old man named Roberto, and Lena became a small ragtag counterweight to an ominous force. They had to decide whether to give the pager information to the police or to take it themselves. Marcus wanted to go to the police, but his jaw tightened at the thought of sitting on a tip and watching it be misfiled. David said, "We can find Miguel first." Marcus looked at David with something like surprise and then something like respect. David was not a man who talked in plans, but he had watched his neighborhood for decades. He knew where men who wanted to disappear kept their keys. He had friends at the diner, at the school, at the port. He could run errands and stay invisible in a way the police could not. They made a plan that balances on a moral ledge. Lena would patch into a camera at a warehouse on the pier and try to catch Ortiz's men. Marcus would call in a favor from Father Miguel, a retired harbor captain who knew ropes and the way the tide hid footprints. Roberto would go home and tell people he was going fishing when he would be hiding in his apartment waiting for news. David would do the mundane work of reading the ledger, asking small questions at the bakery and the laundromat, piecing together where Elias had been the week he vanished. They all moved like people who were trying to keep their friends alive and their hands clean. That night, the city tasted like metal and diesel. Marcus sat at the counter of a diner and watched the door. He ran his thumb over a scar that traced his knuckle, a small private map. He and Lena exchanged dry jokes to keep from saying the word Mafia aloud. Lena hooked a camera feed to a spare laptop and squinted at the grainy images. There, at 9 p.m., a black van pulled up near the warehouse. 3 men stepped out with boxes, and a tall man with a scarf tucked into his collar lingered by the door. The camera was fuzzy, but the scarf had a small woven pattern that Lena recognized from an old court photo. She whispered, "Ortiz." The screen hummed as rain began to streak the glass. Marcus swallowed and said, "We move at first light." The meeting that had been canceled felt less like a cancellation and more like a tip that something had shifted. It meant someone had been taken elsewhere. It meant Ortiz was on the move and that their ledger would be updated. Marcus and David were not armed in any official way. Marcus had a legal license that allowed for more than a wristwatch perhaps, a pass that made other men think twice. David had a duffel bag with bread and a pair of gloves. The neighborhood had decided to be the hero it could be. At daybreak, they watched the pier from a low wall, the horizon a dim bruise. The city gave off the smell of steam and old coffee, and gulls argued like neighbors who will not be quiet. Scenes at the pier unspooled with a slow, cinematic pressure. Marcus and David moved in silence. Marcus whispered tactical notes short and sharp, while David asked questions that sounded like small talk, but were meant to gather a pattern. They traded words like a practice team, even though they had never been one. The men at the warehouse moved like people who had rehearsed the smallest gestures. Ortiz's men loaded wooden crates stamped with the same snake eating its tail, crates that smelled of salt and new metal. A woman in a fluorescent vest, name tag reading Maria, walked a beat near the gate and waved the van through. Maria would later be named by the ledger as someone coerced into cooperation. The first confrontation came not with bullets, but with revelation. Inside one crate, rusted under a false floor, they found a school ID. It was small, laminated, and belonged to a child named Mateo, with Elias written on the back in a shaky hand. They found a receipt for a bus to a northern town and a list of times with the pager number next to a name, Miguel Castillo. That paper was a breadcrumb, not a destination, and it meant the ledger was not just about goods. It was about people moved like pieces in a private market. They decided to act. Marcus moved toward the gate, gloves on like a man on a ceremony. David stayed to watch the van. Lena whispered updates into Marcus's earpiece. Marcus practiced conversation lines and handed them off to David to memorize. The plan was simple and dangerous. Intercept the van as it left, bluff authority, and force a delay until they could find Miguel. They had no real power. They had the truth and a willingness to get between people and their ledgers. The interception unfolded like a tense choreography. Marcus positioned himself behind a telephone pole and then stepped into the lamplight with the posture of a man who had misplaced his patience. He raised his hand in a slow, authoritative motion. The driver slowed. David, heart like a trapped bird, walked up to the passenger window with a story about a leak in the cargo manifest that needed checking. The driver was a younger man, twitchy and very careful. He opened the window, hands visibly trembling. David spoke with the bakery voice he used to smooth complaints over bad coffee. The driver mentioned an offhand name, and then the tall man with the scarf got out too quickly, moving like someone who has practiced a quick decision. Dialogue at that gate swelled into the dense rhythm the neighborhood would remember. David, excuse me, sir, paperwork issue, need to see a manifest. Driver, we cannot stop here, boss will be mad. Marcus, boss is not here, we just need to see the box numbers. Driver, I do not have paperwork on me. Marcus, then step aside, sir. Tall man, you do not know who you are talking to. Marcus, try me. Tall man, Ortiz does not tolerate interference. David, we are not interfering, we are checking on a child. That is not your business. David, it becomes our business when a man is missing and his son is on a manifest. Who gave you that information? David, we have a pager, do you know that word? Tall man, where is the pager? Marcus, it is in the safe house right now because you gave it to someone who is not here, sir. Tall man, you will regret standing between me and my work. Marcus, try me. Driver, please, please no trouble. The driver made a sudden move toward the van as if to drive off. Marcus stepped in front of the wheel, palms flat, like a man taking a dare seriously. He did not brandish a weapon. He used presence. He used the kind of slow, steady energy that made small men think twice. The tall man parked a laugh that did not reach his eyes and reached into his coat but then paused. Across the pier, a siren wailed like a thing about to tell truth. The driver shoved the van into reverse to wedge it, a cheap move that would trap them in place. The tall man cursed, and then, in a heartbeat, two more men stepped out from the shadows, larger, blades tucked into the back pockets of jeans. David realized then they were outmatched in muscle, if not in wits. He thought of Elias's mug and the child on the laminated ID and felt his throat tighten. The confrontation ended not with a shootout but with information. A man in a reflective vest named Jorge approached carrying a clipboard and pretended to be an inspector. He barked a question at Ortiz and then asked for identification. Ortiz glared at him but produced nothing, because he had been planning to avoid inspectors. Jorge flashed a smile and an official badge that he had borrowed from a friend. He was a small, local man who kept things turning for a living and whose loans were large in neighbors. The fake official had authority by presentation. Ortiz cursed, took his men, and left with a promise scrawled on a face like an order. This is not over. Marcus watched them go and said nothing. David held the child ID like a small sacrament. They had not rescued anyone that day, but they had delayed Ortiz. The delay mattered because it allowed Lena to pull footage from another camera and find a clue. A shadow stayed at the edge of the lot that night, a man watching the men who were watching the pier. Lena enhanced the frame and found a face she knew from back when she repaired phones for dock workers. It was Father Miguel, before he retired from the harbor, now older, wearing a baseball cap and a jacket too warm for the early summer night. He was talking to a figure in a hoodie, and then slipping something into his palm. The frame was a sliver, but it was enough. At the 33% mark of what would become a long night, we pause for a moment to ask you, the viewer, a simple question. Have you ever stepped in to help someone who was not your family and felt the weight of that choice afterward? Share a short line below about a time you or someone you know made that choice. Your comments help us understand how communities carry risk and how ordinary people become protectors. The common pause was not a plea for heroism, but a way to collect the quiet courage that swells in neighborhoods when formal systems fail them. While the page of comments grew and the small community offered their own stories, the team moved faster. Father Miguel, the harbor captain, had been in contact with Elias 2 weeks before he vanished. He had a map of the routes boats took and a ledger of names he had kept from unimportant men who did important things. When they reached out to him, he agreed to meet at a bench near the old lighthouse. He smelled of diesel and lemon oil and had a cane that tapped to a rhythm he insisted on hearing. Backstory arrived in paragraphs of memory. David had grown up in a third-floor walk-up above a bakery where his mother worked the early morning shift and his father worked the night. He learned the routes of the city before he could read a map and could tell you where to find tea at midnight. He had been in love once with a woman who left the neighborhood to teach abroad and came back with foreign patients and worse news about taxes. He had a younger sister, Rosa, who taught first grade and who would later appear in this story to demand that he stop and consider the cost of risks. His backstory was ordinary and long, like the seams of clothing worn thin by honesty. Marcus had been a security guard for clubs and for men who kept doors closed for a living. He had a past with a room full of names and the sound of a gavel that announced his departure from that world. He had a code that ran between loyalty and regret, a belief that some debts could be paid with action rather than money. He had lost a brother to a misfired ledger and carried a photo of him in his billfold. He could look like a man with a past that kept his back to the wall and his hands clean because he chose when to soil them. Father Miguel had been a harbor captain and an expert in tides and small boats, the kind of man who read currents the way others read the weather. He had a history with Ortiz that involved a loan and a betrayal, a promise he broke reluctantly. He kept a ledger too, but his was written in the margins of other men's lives. He felt responsibility for the men who worked under the cranes. He had lost a son to the sea and never stopped apologizing. Ortiz, the antagonist, had a backstory of his own. He began in the margins of the docks as a runner, moving boxes and messages for men who had more power than heart. He learned quickly how to make men do what he wanted. In 2 paragraphs, Ortiz grew into his role because of an early promise to a man who offered him security in exchange for silence. He watched men like Elias with a kindness that was always thin as a razor and a hold that tightened with each favor. In the final paragraph of his backstory, Ortiz had inherited a ledger when his mentor was arrested years ago, and he believed in order. He believed that debts measured out in people and goods kept the world from chaos. He could not see that his order ate people like a tide eats sand. Those backstories were not confessions, but maps. They told why a bakery driver would stand in a pier and argue with men in jeans, and why a man of the cloth might deal with a hoodie. They revealed fractures, loyalties, and the small rituals that make a community work. As the investigation slid forward, technical details became essential. Lena explained how she would pull camera footage and cross-reference timestamps with pager beeps. She described the chain of custody she would fake by overlaying frames and adjusting metadata so that if the men at Ortiz's warehouse tried to scrub their movements, a ghostly trail would remain. The explanation was short and efficient. She would clone a frame and timestamp it, then seed it in public channels where Ortiz's men would not think to look. It was clever and borderline illegal, and it worked. Within hours, they had a new piece of visual evidence showing Ortiz meeting a figure named Ricardo at the warehouse 2 nights before Elias vanished. The technical description was only a bridge to action, but it bought them leverage. The first major moment of tension came when they found Miguel, but not as they expected. It was a dark alley behind a fish market where the smell of brine and rot twisted into the night air. David and Marcus crept with the careful rhythm of people who are not trained but have learned to imitate training with their breath. A camera they had not noticed blinked like an eye above a doorway and then went out. Marcus whispered, "Stay low." David, "I am leaving if this goes wrong." Marcus, "That is a choice you always have." The alley opened to a fenced yard where a van idled with the engine humming like a sleeping animal. They moved in, and a man stepped out, bleeding at the temple, but alive, bound with rough rope. Miguel looked older than his photos, more fragile, and his voice when he called Marcus was a thing that held apology and warning at once. He said, "It was meant to be a warning. They keep lists. They were taking names in groups now, not only money." The scene lasted with time stretched between the beat of passerby footsteps and the crinkling of a plastic bag in the far corner. The men at the van were not ready for a pair of neighbors who had nothing to lose. They were clumsy and scared. The pair managed to free Miguel and get him into a car with the engine warming and the heater smelling like old upholstery. It was a small victory, but it brought to the surface a terrible fact. Ortiz was not just moving goods. He was moving people as commodities in a ledger system that had metastasized into kidnappings for leverage. The second moment of tension happened in the diner at night when the community reacted. People came in and out carrying things like casseroles and notes. Rosa, the teacher, brought Miguel soup. Maria from the port confessed to a ledger entry that had her name because she once owed someone a favor. Father Miguel sat and apologized to Elias's father Roberto out loud in public for mistakes only he felt forgiven. There was an argument when someone suggested they pay Ortiz back with money rather than risk lives. Rosa said, "We cannot trade another life for his silence." Marcus answered, "Sometimes silence has a cost greater than money." Words flew like knives. The moment slowed as the group realized the ledger had teeth that could bite them all. In 2 paragraphs, the scene stretched into quiet decisions and a map of who would do what. The third moment of tension would be the climax at the pier, and it would be longer. And harder than the others. They would arrange a plan with 3 phases: disruption, extraction, and cover. Marcus and David led the disruption with a phone call that sounded like a complaint about noisy loading. Lena would be inside the building to feed false footage. Father Miguel would meet a ferry at the far end to ensure a clean exit. Jorge, the fake inspector, would create a blockade to delay reinforcements. Each person had a role that balanced together like the fragile construction of an old bridge. Before the plan began, Roberto pressed the brass key into Elias's son's small hand and said, "Keep this until we come back." The child did not understand but held it like a coin of hope. The execution of the plan was a set piece. The warehouse hummed with the sound of forklifts and the clank of chains. The camera hung like an accused eye. Marcus moved with a calm that seemed to originate from a place where he had rehearsed the outcome many times in the dark. They initiated phase 1 by cutting power to the perimeter lights, plunging the pier into a low and quiet chaos. Lena fed a loop to the security monitors that showed crates being piled when in reality the workers were fleeing into side doors. Jorge and Maria created a human blockade with a van and an official tone. The air smelled of oil, hot metal, and the citrus cleaner David used to freshen his hands. Then a shout, "Someone sees them!" Ortiz felt the net and moved in like a man swallowing pride. Inside, Miguel had been hidden in a crate behind stacked boxes of engine parts. He coughed when the box was opened and squinted at daylight like a man returning from another life. Elias was found in a room beside a mechanic's bench, bruised but alive. He had a small tattoo on his wrist that matched the symbol on the scrap. They freed him, but Ortiz's men reacted with the brutal speed of a ledger being defended. The fight was a dull and loud thing, filled with the clang of metal against metal, the sound of a chair crashing to the concrete, and Marcus yelling orders in a short, sharp way that sounded like a commandment. David moved with desperation, not training. He blocked the blow that would have cracked a man's cheek and took a cut on his forearm that bled dark and fast. Lena pulled cords and shouted updates. Jorge blocked the doorway and took a bruise to his shoulder. The class was resolved when a loud horn at the dock signaled a scheduled inspection that Jorge had paid for with an official and complicated phone call. Right in the middle of the fight, blinking lights appeared as if from nowhere, and a formal team rolled up. Ortiz and his men melted into shadows, values accounted for, crates pushed toward outgoing shipments. The public appearance forced a retreat. Ortiz escaped, but he had left a list of names, a ledger page smudged with ink. It would become evidence. After the set piece, the immediate fallout opened wounds and clarified rulings. There were arrests around the edges, men briefly taken by authorities who had been tipped by a man with a badge Jorge had borrowed, and by leads planted footage. Ortiz, cunning, had no direct ties that could be pinned to him in public, but his men paid with time in lockup and bruises. Elias was taken to a clinic where a nurse named Farid, a quiet man with a steady hand, stitched his arm while Elias stared at his palms like they had become strangers. The community breathed a small, ragged sigh. The ledger had been pried open, its teeth exposed. People who had been coerced came forward with small claims and bigger stories. There were technical explanations after the raid. A forensic exam of the crates revealed the pattern of shipping numbers rerouted through shell companies. A simple forensic explanation: investigators cross-referenced barcodes and found duplicates rerouted through shell accounts. The result was a paper trail that could be followed. The description was exacting and plain. Barcodes were scanned at times that did not match manifest times. Crate weights did not correlate. Shipping receipts had different handwritings. It was enough for an investigative officer to request warrants. That small technical mapping made the ledger a thing the law could touch, even if Ortiz remained in the shadows. The consequences were complicated. News of the raid leaked. A local blog ran a piece with a headline that suggested vigilante action rather than community protection. The city reacted publicly with cautious praise for bravery and a private cautionary lecture on taking the law into your own hands. Some men watched their properties with a new distance. Father Miguel resigned from his volunteer position at the port until matters cooled. Rosa went back to school wearing a tight face that said she would teach again, but not at the expense of her family. Marcus accepted a summons to speak to a detective who asked carefully worded questions. Elias reunited with Roberto with a hug that cracked the old man like a brittle branch, and a child who cleaned his hands on a rag and then ran into the street to see if the world still moved. The ledger had been dented but not destroyed. Over the next weeks, smaller threads unspooled into louder sound. Ortiz, furious and humiliated, stepped up his tactics. He sent notes through intermediaries with threats and promises. He used a man named Ricardo to test the neighborhood's resolve. The community tightened like a fist. A bakery that David delivered to saw fewer customers for a few days because people feared being seen with him. Rosa called David to tell him to stop coming into spaces that might endanger her class of 5-year-olds. David promised and then went up to a boat to speak with a man who owed him nothing and gave him a story. It was the sort of promise that mattered in a way money never could. 3 months of small actions followed: tampered phone lines, dead drops, and a slow, grinding process of putting together a case. That process required people to testify, to remember things they had tried to forget. Lena testified about the camera feeds she had spliced. Jorge admitted to creating a fake inspection to create a diversion. Father Miguel handed over a log of boats that had been out of schedule and explained why certain ferries had been used as unregistered carriers. Each technical deposition added a brick to a wall the authorities could not ignore. The legal process moved like a ship in a mast that takes time to pivot. The epilogue arrives in 3 time slices that show the stitches, the new skin, and the scars. 1 month later, The city had not forgiven everything, but a small piece had settled into parts of the neighborhood. Elias visited the bakery and bought a loaf of bread with paper money he had earned doing odd jobs for the man who took him in temporarily. Roberto sat in the window and watched the street like a man whose heart had been rearranged. Marcus taught a neighborhood watch and made sure the kids knew a safe route to school. Rosa returned to her classroom with a new rule: no unexpected pickups unless she signed off. The ledger that Ortiz kept had holes where names had been scratched out and marked irrelevant. People were quieter with their debts. The brass key rested on Elias's kitchen table like a relic, a small, heavy object that marked a night when everything shifted. The smell of coffee came when the window was opened and the city settled. They had won a small thing, but the victory tasted of exhaustion and the knowledge that the ledger would adapt. The doors were locked a little more carefully at night. People hummed in the afternoon like survivors. 3 months later, a court case was open. Some men who had been middlemen were now in custody and giving statements. The ledger was more fractured. Journalists came and asked questions that harrowed the neighborhood, asking who had taken law into their own hands and whether vigilantism was ever justified. Elias got a part-time job cleaning boats and fixed small engines. He began to learn a trade that could keep him afloat and rebuild trust with Roberto. Marcus found a low-profile job advising a private security company that asked him to design routes that would not be obvious to people who watched for patterns. The community created an emergency contact list and learned to testify with the same calm they used to make coffee. The brass key had a story attached to it now. It opened a storage unit that had been a safety deposit for a man who trusted it. No one. The child who had held it had come to understand that secrets carried weight and that some grown-ups would risk more than money to keep others safe. 6 months later, the ledger was a legal exhibit with pages and ink and witness testimony. Ortiz still walked the city in a different way, quieter, like a man who knows footprints are being watched. He had moved some operations to other towns, the way rot shifts when you pry at its edges. The mayor publicly recognized neighborhood efforts in a speech that felt like a bandage over a deeper wound. Father Miguel had a small plaque at the harbor, a bench where people left coins for fishermen. Elena, a neighbor who had been silent through most of this, opened a small community kitchen that fed volunteers and created a rotating roster of people who patrolled loved ones. David continued to make deliveries, his arm now a faint white line across the skin. He had not become a hero overnight. He was a man who had chosen once and then again and who understood the cost. On a late afternoon, he walked to the pier and sat where the light went thin. He felt the brass key in his pocket and imagined the ledger like a tide. Sometimes it receded and showed broken shells, and sometimes it came in hard enough to wash away footprints. The future was not neat, but the neighborhood had a new pattern of looking out for each other. In the end, justice arrived imperfectly. Some arrests became convictions, some men were never found, and the ledger had blank pages where people would have liked to write names. The community had to live with a truth that some things cannot be entirely corrected. But there was also a softer gift, a new sense of who could be trusted, and a small, resilient network of people who kept an eye on each other. David learned that courage was not a single grand act, but a string of small choices. Marcus learned that redemption was a sequence of careful actions rather than a sudden forgiveness. Roberto got his son home, bruised but alive, and found that his tears had not been wasted. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments which choice you think carries the most weight: the choice to act, the choice to speak, or the choice to walk away. Your voice matters to people making decisions in quiet lots and in crowded rooms. The last image is simple and human. David and Elias walked along the pier at dusk. Elias held the brass key between his fingers and turned it like a small worry. A gull cried someplace up above as the city brightened with a hum of life that was always messy and always moving. Elias looked at David and said a small, honest thing: "Thank you." David said, "We did what we could." Marcus watched them from the far bench, his silhouette a flat proof that someone kept their post. The brass key glinted dull in the light. It was not a talisman that ended danger. It was a thing that proved people could choose to hold on to one another. If you like this story and want to hear more of these neighborhood fights against the ledgers that hide in plain sight, subscribe and check the playlist for similar cases. And remember, sometimes the most ordinary person is the one who opens a locked box and finds a life worth saving.